Welcome to this presentation on the ESOTOC conceptual framework for polymer risk assessment, CF for polymers, considerations and examples for grouping of polymers. My name is Jens Otter, and I'm presenting this on behalf of the co-authors on that slide, and welcome you all to the CTEC Europe annual meeting. When talking about grouping of polymers, one needs to consider that polymers are different than small molecules. So we have to think a little bit differently. And the reason for that is the building block nature of polymer chemistry, which implies a specific approach. There are diverse architectural elements, for example, polymer composition, which means there are different monomers with different properties. And the relative amount and the distribution in the polymer chain makes it specific for the polymer. There's also the polymer topology, which consists of the shape and the distribution of branches and the cross-linking or attachments to a core. There's also polymer functionality with different functional groups, different properties and relative amount, and finally, a different distribution in the polymer. So this makes polymer chemistry really a compositional approach, which means we finally end up with a distribution of features. It's always a distribution of molar mass, of composition, of topology, and functionality. And what many polymers and many functional polymers in particular have in common is a high molecular mass and often limited solubility. Taking all this into account, we can consider that small chemical variation in different building blocks usually do not result in significant phys-chem and biological differences. Coming from a building block nature of chemistry and polymer chemistry, we need a dedicated grouping approach to polymers. So polymer chemistry is a little bit different. So it needs a different approach. But how to structure? You may take a look on the picture of the left. You see the Lego bricks, and you might wonder yourself how to put them into boxes, how to put them into buckets in a meaningful way. And we want to come up here with a proposal for the polymer world. For doing so, we made use of internationally recognized grouping concepts and have advanced them further to better scope the complexity and versatility of polymers. A central role has been assigned to the term hazard similarity, which is key in defining the final group. In addition to that, the polymer grouping approach proposed here also allows to significantly simplify and structure the data requirements for polymer hazard and risk assessment, and it gives rise to a pragmatic and reasonable description of substance identity for polymers. Based on the conceptual framework for polymer risk assessment as laid out in previous reports by the ESOTOC task force, the proposed grouping approach, which is part of that conceptual framework, consists of 5 steps. It's step 1, which uses expert judgment to identify key parameters of that grouping. Step 2 determines polymer similarity, which means the potential for grouping. Step 3 defines the hypothesis for grouping to determine the relevant approach. And finally, in step 4, one identifies available data for fate, ecotox, and toxicity. And finally, in step 5, it's about to justify and to document the grouping along all 3 criteria. This sequence of steps is not necessarily performed in the consecutive order, which means that once you reach step 4 and you recognize that your hypothesis is not proven valid, you may go back to step 1 and start once over. And this approach presented here enhances the outline of step 1 to 5 by introducing a 3-criteria approach to defining and justifying the polymer similarity throughout these 5 steps. And this is on the next slide. To enhance the grouping approach evaluation, we introduce 3 criteria. Criterion 1, chemical nature, which is equally important as criterion 2 with physical chemical properties. And again, equally important and corresponding to all of these is criterion 3, ecological and toxicological properties. All of them finally make up the common goal on the grouping approach, which is hazard similarity by the final group. So this is the basic principle for polymer grouping. It follows the 3 criteria on the left and is balanced of aspects represented therein. And finally, all criteria serve to establish the hazard similarity of the final group. So how to do the grouping actually? I put this into a nice graphics on the left. So usually you start with criterion 1 with chemical similarity, right? You search for similar chemistry of your pool of polymers to be grouped. Once done that, you go to phys-chem properties and see what you can sort out there and put these into buckets. And once you're done there, you finally group according to ecological and toxicological properties and the known key endpoints only. Overall, this brings you to the target of hazard similarity. So while going along these criteria 1, criteria 2, and 3, you will end up with similar properties with hazard similarity of your final polymer. And if needed, you may come up to refine hazard similarity criteria and group boundaries. All these 3 criteria are indispensable to describe the hazard similarity of the group, and the hazard similarity is taken as the central element and the ultimate goal when defining and justifying the polymer group. An important piece of finally justifying the polymer group is to identify the level of similarity needed. So usually the relevant hazard properties within your group that are comprised and related to a common key feature, which may relate it to phys-chem or chemistry. The effect level of these relevant hazard properties of a group member from one end to the other group does not necessarily have to be the same as those for group members of the other end, but it has to be predictable in their hazard properties in the meaning of similarity. So overall, it can be different but predictable. The relevant hazard properties as such, for example, acute oral toxicity or acute aquatic hazards, need to be the same for the entire group. This can be 1 or 2 relevant hazard properties, or even 3, but not too many. And there needs to be a continuum and a predictivity of the relevant hazard property, which needs to be established and justified. To summarize on the polymer grouping approach that has been presented so far. First of all, the building block nature and resulting complexity and versatility of polymer chemistry serves a dedicated concept for grouping. Polymers are different compared to small molecules. The polymer grouping approach described herein should be viewed as a targeted and flexible framework. The internationally agreed grouping concepts have been further advanced, and the concept of hazard similarity has been added to scope with the complexity. The description along 3 combined axes of criteria allows the description of polymer groups and polymer identity. Certain steps, as presented in the previous slides, of this approach may be of higher or lower importance depending on the final type of polymer. Thank you for listening and your interest in polymer grouping. There are further contributions on polymers by the ESA-TOC Task Force on Polymers. In 2019, the ESA-TOC Task Force published a conceptual framework for polymer risk assessment. And in 2020, there's a report on applicability of analytical tools, test methods, and models for polymer risk assessment. And finally, last year, the task force published case studies putting the ESA-TOC framework into practice. And this report from 2021 also includes case studies that put this grouping concepts into reality. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.